Well, thank you very much for joining us for this webinar, which introduces the methodology for this year's Forest 500 assessments. My name is Hannah Franklin, Corporate Performance Communications Lead at Global Canopy, and I'll be moderating this webinar. This webinar is being recorded and emailed out to all of the companies included in the 2024 selection, so don't worry if you feel like you've missed anything, you'll be able to catch up. There will also be an opportunity for questions, so please use the Q&A box and we'll try to cover as many of these as we can. So let's start with a bit of context around why your company should be acting on deforestation if it isn't already doing so. If deforestation were a country, it would be the third highest emitter in the world. Deforestation matters for climate. Net zero targets cannot be achieved without eliminating it. Successfully tackling deforestation requires effective action on the human rights abuses associated with it. And please watch our recent webinar that explains how to act on that. So 2025 will be a decisive year for action on deforestation. For the first time, businesses will be required to show that EU imports of key agricultural commodities are deforestation-free, as the EU deforestation regulation requirements take effect at the end of 2024 or mid-2025 for small and medium-sized enterprises. 2025 also marks the United Nations deadline for companies and financial institutions to eliminate commodity-driven deforestation from their portfolios. And it's the year when the eyes of the world will focus on deforestation, as the biggest climate conference of the year, COP30, takes place in Belém, the closest major city to the Amazon. So there really is no better time to act than now. For the past decade, Forest 500, a global canopy project, has identified the companies and financial institutions with the greatest exposure to tropical deforestation risk. It assesses them on the strength and implementation of their commitments on deforestation, conversion, and natural ecosystems and associated human rights. This year, the scope of our assessments has expanded, and Emma will be giving you a bit more information about that shortly. Once again, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box provided. For questions that are specific to your company's selection or assessment, please save these for later and reach out to us via email. Before we get started, we wanted to take a moment to just get your input on a quick poll. The results of this poll will be brought up on screen, but will be shown anonymously. So please do share your thoughts on this. So the question is, what is the biggest challenge your company is facing in achieving supply chains that are free from deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses? Maybe it's setting clear targets to be conversion and deforestation free. Maybe it's reporting on progress. Perhaps it's a lack of transparency within your supply chains. Perhaps it's eliminating the associated human rights abuses from supply chains, complying with incoming due diligence legislation, or the varying complexities across different commodity supply chains. We just give you a moment for that one. Once again, what is the biggest challenge your company is facing in achieving supply chains that are free from deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses? I think we might be ready to see the answers. Let's have a look. Okay, so we can see that the varying complexities across different commodities is really coming out as the key challenge, with 50% of respondents, followed by lack of transparency within supply chains. So thank you for sharing that. So I'm going to pass over to Emma now, who's going to give us a bit more information about Forest 500 and this year's assessments.
Great. Thanks, Hannah, and thanks everyone for joining us today to find out more about the 2024 methodology and assessment period in general. There's going to be a fair amount of information in the next few minutes. And I know some of you are already familiar with the Forest 500, but I did just want to take a few minutes to give a quick introduction to what Forest 500 is and how our assessment process works. If I could have the next slide, please. Yes, thank you. So in 2014, Forest 500 was developed to hold companies and financial institutions accountable to the deforestation commitments that they were making as part of things like the New York Declaration on Forests and the Consumer Goods Forum. So although those commitments were missed, Forest 500 has continued to assess companies and financial institutions on the strength and implementation of their approach on deforestation, ecosystem conversion, and associated human rights abuses. These assessments are done once a year using publicly available information and are published on our website, which you can see on the screen, forest500.org, in the first quarter of each year alongside an annual report. We've been doing these assessments for over 10 years now. And before we get into the 2024 assessment process and methodology, I wanted to share a very quick snapshot of where the companies we assessed in 2023 are or were at the time of the assessments. If I could have the next slide, please. So 30% of the 350 companies that we assessed last year had no publicly available deforestation commitments on their website. So that's nearly a third of the companies that we selected. If I could have the next slide, please. And then of those that did have at least one publicly available deforestation commitment, 63% failing to show adequate evidence of implementation of that commitment. So although there are some pockets of progress within the results last year, we do still need to see considerable action from many companies in forest risk commodity supply chains. I could have the next slide, please. So on to a bit more detail about this year's assessment period. So a couple of things have changed since our 2023 assessment, as you can see on the screen. So this year, we will be including 3 new forest risk commodities in our assessments. So in addition to palm oil, soy, beef, leather, timber, and pulp and paper, which have been assessed by the Forest 500 for 10 years now, we will now also be assessing companies on cocoa, coffee, and rubber, which will closely align with the commodities included in the EUDR. We'll also be including all forest types. So deforestation is a global issue that companies must address across all types of forest. This is why at both our selection and the assessment stages of the process this year, we have expanded the scope of our assessments to include forests beyond tropical forests, but also non-tropical forest types, such as boreal and temperate forest. And we've also added an additional 150 companies to our selection. We've expanded our coverage to 500 companies with the greatest influence on deforestation, up from the 350 that we've assessed in previous years. The next slide, please. These expansions have all been reflected in the 2024 company selection, as I said. The 500 companies that we have included in our 2024 selection are the 500 companies that have the greatest influence on deforestation through their forest risk commodity supply chains. To identify them, we first need to identify the countries which are producing the greatest volume of each of those 9 commodities and which also have the greatest amount of forest loss. We then identify which countries are importing and exporting the greatest value of each of those commodities in their various different forms. And that country selection is then used as a guide to inform our selection of companies. This is done using a variety of data and metrics to identify which companies have the highest exposure to deforestation risk based on the volumes of each of the 9 forest risk commodities that they are producing, procuring, or using. So again, this year, that is beef, palm oil, soy, paper, timber, cocoa, coffee, rubber, and leather. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. We then use this as a basis to select companies throughout forest risk supply chains. We group supply chains into the 5 sections or categories that you can see on the screen. So we have producers, we have processors, traders, manufacturers, and retailers. We select a roughly equal number of companies at each of those 5 supply chain stages across each of the 9 commodities. And all of the companies that we select or that are included in our selection are considered a power broker for at least one of those 9 commodities that we focus on. But companies will also be assessed for any of the other 9 commodities that they're exposed to, but that don't use enough volumes of to be considered a power broker. These 500 companies are then assessed on the strength and implementation of their publicly available commitments on deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses.
Thanks, Anna, for giving us that very helpful overview of the 2024 assessments and how they've changed from 2023. Again, if you have any questions, please do put them in the Q&A and don't be shy. Emma, could we now just move on to talking a bit more about the 2024 assessment process and just more of the technical details around exactly how companies will be assessed?
Yes, definitely. Thank you. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So, as you will all have been notified by email about a week and a half ago now, the 2024 company assessment period started on the 29th of April and is expected to run until the 20th of September this year. Any information that is publicly available on your company's website during the assessment period will be considered in your 2024 assessment. So that can be anything from a policy document to an annual report, to a press release. All of that information that's available on your website will be reviewed and considered for your 2024 assessment. All 500 companies will be assessed on the strength and implementation of their commitments on deforestation, on conversion, and the associated human rights abuses. So looking at the commitments that are applied to their supply chains, so that would include, as a very short example, does the company have a strong deforestation commitment with an ambitious target date? Are they verifying and reporting on progress against their deforestation commitment? Through to, are they publishing evidence of the implementation of their free, prior, and informed consent commitment? These assessments are done against the best practice for companies in forest risk commodity supply chains. And as you can see on the end of the slide there, once the assessments have been completed, they will then be published on forest500.org in early 2025. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So as was the case last year, companies assessed in the Forest 500 will have, will be able to view their completed assessment before it is made publicly available in early 2025. The completed assessment will be available to be viewed on a purpose-built platform where companies can provide optional comments if needed on the assessment, provided that any documents or information is accessible on publicly available links that were available during the 2024 assessment period. So again, between those April and September dates. The window within which companies will be able to view their assessment will be in October 2024, and companies will be given several weeks within which their assessment can be viewed. We will follow up with you with precise dates shortly, but once we send those over, please do ensure that a member of your team is available during the week specified if you would like to view your assessment before it is published. It is not necessary. And you will receive more information about that process closer to the time, including how to access the platform. So please do keep an eye out on your emails from us at forest500@globalcanopy.org. And you can also email us if you have any other email addresses that you would like to be contacted in relation to your company's assessment as well. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So I now wanted to take you through some of the key changes to the assessment methodology itself this year. The full detail of what's changed and how will be available in the methodology document, which will be available on our website shortly, but I did just want to give a very quick overview now. If I could have the next slide, please. So this year, our assessment methodology is made up of 5 sections. So we have the overall approach, which is looking at a company's high-level approach on deforestation and human rights issues. We have commitment strength, which looks at the strength and scope of commitments on deforestation. We have associated human rights abuses, which looks at the strength of commitments on the human rights abuses that are frequently associated with deforestation, so including through prior and informed consent and respecting customary rights to land, resources, and territory. And then we also have implementation, which is how is the company implementing their commitments and what processes do they have in place to do so. So this will look at both deforestation and associated human rights abuses. And then we also have reporting and verification. So how the company is transparently reporting on and verifying their progress towards their commitments. And again, that will look at both deforestation and associated human rights abuses. If I could have the next slide, please. So here on the table, thank you, you can see the 5 sections of our methodology and also what proportion of a company's total score is made up from each section of the methodology. So we have continued the shift in focus of our methodology towards implementation and towards reporting and verification, with the score of those sections of the methodology now representing a combined 75% of a company's total score. That is a percentage that has steadily increased since 2014 over the past 10 years. As you can also see, commitment strength is now worth 6.5% of a company's total score. That has fallen a little bit since last year as we've adjusted our methodology. And so traceability commitments, which were previously included in this section, are now, we're now looking at traceability systems instead, and that is now in the implementation section. We've also got the associated human rights section at 10.5%. So that's again looking at the commitments on associated human rights, with more points on that topic in the implementation and reporting and verification sections. And then finally, overall approach, so that high level approach of a company on deforestation is worth 8% of a total score. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. And the next slide as well, please. Thank you. So I now wanted to take you through some of the key changes to the methodology from this year. I've already mentioned a couple, but the full detail of what's changed and how will be available in the methodology document, but here is a quick overview. So here you can see 3 new indicators that we've added to the Forest 500 methodology this year. As you can see, the first 2 listed are non-scoring, so won't impact the score of a company. We have, does the company have a commitment that prohibits bribery and corruption within its own operations and or its forest risk commodity supply chains? We've got, does the company disclose a commitment or strategy that would lead its business model to become nature and people positive? And then the third one that you can see is a new scoring indicator, which is, does the company require its suppliers to be aligned with or committed to at least one of the company standards, which addresses human rights abuses of forest risk supply chains across all of their operations, not just the volume supplying the company. So this one is really about companies using their influence to push change up through the supply chain, through requiring suppliers to be compliant across the entirety of the supplier's operations. The next slide, please. Thank you. We've also removed a non-scoring indicator, which you can see on the screen. So this will have no influence on company scores. But this indicator is, does the company conduct or support remediation, including ecological restoration, to address non-compliance in its operations or supply chain? This has been removed as a separate or unique indicator, but this information is still collected within one of our other indicators. So we are still looking for companies to report this, just not as a separate indicator. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. Yes, so I appreciate that there's been a lot of information already, and there will be more to follow, but just wanted to kind of go through some of the most frequently asked questions of the methodology, and maybe some of the questions that you have right now. But if you do have any more questions as we're going along, please do put them in the Q&A box as well at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to them shortly. So if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So have the companies identified to be in the Forest 500 been directly linked to causing deforestation? The companies that are included in the Forest 500 have significant influence over the production and processing of the commodities that do drive deforestation through their supply chains. Through those activities, these companies are at significant risk of driving deforestation and the associated human rights abuses, but we are not saying that these companies are deforesting within their supply chains, just that the risk and the influence that these companies have is high because of the volumes that they are procuring or producing. And these companies, the 500, do need to set and implement effective commitments to prevent that deforestation from happening in their supply chains. The next question, please. Thank you. So just to recap which commodities we do look at. So in the past 10 years of the Forest 500, we have focused on the 6 that you can see at the top. So palm oil, soy, beef, leather, timber, and pulp and paper. And then new this year, those 3 at the bottom are cocoa, coffee, and rubber. So companies will be assessed on any of those commodities that they are exposed to through their supply chains, and all have been identified as a power broker, so one of the companies with the greatest influence on that commodity for at least one of those 9 commodities. Next slide, please. Thank you. What is a Forest 500 power broker? So that's a word that we've used a few times so far, but it is essentially a word that we use to describe the companies that we select, so those that have the greatest influence on deforestation through their production or use of at least one of those 9 forest risk commodities. Companies are selected as a power broker based on their exposure to those commodities, which, as I mentioned, we identify using a variety of metrics from land bank area owned or volume of commodity used, or even proportion of global market share or global revenue. Companies that are power brokers for one commodity can also produce or use those other forest risk commodities. And if their exposure or usage of those commodities is not sufficient to be a power broker, they are still assessed for additional commodities, but scores are weighted lower for the non-power broker commodities. So that will reflect the reduced influence that companies have on those non-power broker commodities. The next slide, please. Thank you. The Forest 500 has been assessing companies and financial institutions since 2014. So our methodologies have been annually reviewed for their alignment with best practice since 2014. In 2020, we aligned with the first iteration of the Accountability Framework Initiative's common methodology. And that methodology was updated and published again this year. So for our 2024 methodology, we have also aligned with the updated common methodology from the Accountability Framework Initiative and continue to annually review it aligned with best practice, or to make sure it continues to align with best practice alongside that update as well. The next slide, please. So as we've mentioned, we do only look at publicly available information. So any information that your company has published on your website will be considered as part of your assessment, but we do require that information to be publicly available. That is because there needs to be greater transparency from companies if we are to eliminate deforestation and conversion and the associated human rights abuses. Incoming legislation is also requiring greater transparency for companies, and so this shouldn't be adding shouldn't be adding to the amount of reporting you'll already be required to do, but we do require it to be publicly available. We need to enable that collaboration and advances in the shared understanding of the challenges that you're facing, but also the progress that is being made. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So can companies input into the assessments? So no, in terms of inputting, the Forest 500 assessments will continue to be completed independently by Global Canopy. However, once the assessment has been completed and the assessment period has closed, companies will be able to view their assessment, as we mentioned earlier. This will take place in October 2024, with more precise dates to follow soon. If you do have any comments on the assessment, these can be optionally provided within that window of time. And any information shared must still have been publicly available within the assessment period. No privately reported information will be considered at any point during the assessment process. And then the assessment will be published online on forest500.org in early 2025. And again, once the final date for that publication has been confirmed, we will be in touch to let companies know when that will be. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So are companies assessed in English or in the primary language? So wherever possible, power brokers, the companies that we assess, will be assessed in the key languages that they communicate in. So that will be done alongside English. So we work with both our we have translators and interpreters that we work with to translate the information to ensure that companies are being assessed both in English and the primary language of the country where the company is headquartered. So that means that we will be looking for both or either. If the information on your website is only in English, that is completely fine. If it is only in, for example, Dutch, that is also fine. We will consider all information equally. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So this one is something that will be perhaps in your mind already about how our total score bands work and how we translate our scores out of 100 into the score bands of 5 that you might see on our website. So for companies to score 0 out of 5, they will score 0%. That is not scoring for any of the indicators that we assess. Anything from 1% to 19% is scored 1 out of 5. 20 to 39% is equivalent to 2 out of 5, and so on until we get to 80 to 100, which is considered as equivalent to 5 out of 5 in those score bands. This information is available on our website and will also be sent out alongside the total score in early 2025 as well. The next slide, please. Great, thank you. I think that was all of my frequently asked questions that I wanted to cover, so I'll hand back to Hannah.
Thank you, Emma. That was a very comprehensive overview. I'm sure there's lots for people to digest, but please do keep putting your questions into the Q&A because now it's time to hear from you. If there's anything that we haven't covered, it's your time to ask your questions. And the first question that we've got is there a volume threshold for being a power broker for one commodity specifically? For example, what one company buying 100 tons of palm versus 100 tons of soy, would the company be considered a power broker for soy? Sorry, 100,000 tons, that should be.
Thank you. Yes, so as we learned from the poll, there are lots of different, specific commodity supply chains are very different, and the amount of influence that companies have in each one can vary significantly. So there isn't a standard volume threshold that is used or applied across all 9 commodities. It does vary based on the commodity, but it's also not a threshold of just one metric. So we use lots and lots of different data sets and data sources to define or to measure influence. So for, sorry, just trying to think of the best example. So for, say, palm oil at the kind of manufacturer and retail side of the supply chain, those commodities or that commodity is used in hundreds of different products. And within each of those products, different volumes of palm oil are used, and different companies have different influence within each of those. So we essentially bring together a huge amount of data and have different thresholds for different data sources, which are then combined into one. So it's not necessarily that 100,000 tons of palm oil and 1,000 tons of soy means that a company is only a power broker for one and not the other. It does just depend on the commodity itself and how that supply chain is made up.
Thank you, Emma. That clarifies the question. So we've got another question here. I think you have probably touched on it throughout your presentation, but it's worth clarifying. Will we be able to see our assessment before it's published? and when will it be published?
Yes, of course. So this is a process that we introduced to the assessment cycle last year in 2023. So companies are given the opportunity to view their completed assessment in October of this year. We will hope to send out the final dates with at least a month's notice. We appreciate that, you know, there are lots of team dynamics and things to consider. So we do want to give sufficient notice of when that period will be, but it will be in October of this year. Companies will be able to view their assessment for several weeks, and if they do have comments that they would like to share, then they can be done throughout that process, but it is completely optional. So we will send more information about that in the coming weeks, but then the assessment itself will be published on our website in early 2025, along with the total score of each company in the.
Thanks, Emma. And just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded, so do not worry. You have plenty of opportunity to listen back to all of the information that's been disclosed today. We have another question asking, Emma, how are you defining deforestation in non-tropical forests in particular? And is the definition different from the one used for tropical forests?
Great question, thank you. So we use the definition of deforestation from the Accountability Framework Initiative. So we apply that definition across both, well, not just both, but both tropical and non-tropical forest types. So when we're looking for deforestation commitment, it's in line with that definition from the Accountability Framework Initiative. We can put the link to the Accountability Framework into the chat as well. So there's their definition, it's publicly available. And they also have lots of other useful definitions, but also really detailed operational guidance for companies to both understand their definitions more, but also about how to apply this best practice within supply chain. So I can put the link to that in the chat in a few moments.
Great. And you mentioned, Emma, that all of the companies are divided into several categories. So we've got producers, processors, traders. How did Forest 500 decide on which category to put each company, if actually several categories are suitable for that company?
Yes, so some companies are only categorized into one section of the supply chain, but for each commodity, the company is categorized into the segments of the supply chain. So if there is a say a palm oil producer that also produces soap using the palm oil, then they would be categorized as both a palm oil producer and also a palm oil manufacturer. So companies can absolutely be included in multiple segments of the supply chain. There are small differences between the methodology for upstream companies, which we consider to be producers and processors, and downstream companies, which we consider to be traders, manufacturers, and retailers. There are some differences in the methodology there, but that's all captured in the methodology document as well.
Great. Now I've got a question about the notion of a power broker. So does being a power broker mean that you can have a higher score, provided that you have the supporting documents, of course?
Great caveat on that question. Yes, so for companies that are, say, a power broker for two commodities and also assessed as a non-power broker for another commodity, so say a supermarket that is a power broker for palm oil and beef, and then they also use some soy, but very, very little. The scores of that company, our assessments are conducted in the overall approach across the entire company. And then for each commodity that they're exposed to, those four sections of the methodology, so commitment strength, associated human rights abuses, implementation, and reporting and verification, are each assessed once for each of the commodities that are included. Those scores are then added together and divided by the number of commodities. However, for commodities which a company is a power broker for, so where they have that significant influence, those commodity scores are given twice the weighting in the final score. So if you are a power broker for beef and you have all of the supporting documents to score very well in that commodity, then that beef, your score for beef will be given twice the weighting in your total score, so your total score will be higher than if your strong commitments on a non-power broker commodity and very weak commitments and implementation on power broker commodities.
Thanks, Emma. So we're on to our final question. So please do keep putting questions into the Q&A and we'll try to answer as many as we can. Otherwise, final question we have is, how do you assess the implementation of commitments?
So we use a large number of indicators to assess the implementation of those commitments. So although obviously we can't see what is happening in these supply chains other than the information that is publicly reported, what we are looking for in that section of the methodology is, do these companies have the right processes in place to be effectively implementing the commitments that they have set? So looking at, for example, are they doing risk assessments related to associated human rights abuses in their supply chain? And looking really at that process level, which has against the best practice defined by the Accountability Framework Initiative and the Common Methodology. But then we are also in the reporting and verification section looking for the evidence that that implementation is happening. So we've got the commitments, we've got the implementation, which is the processes, and then also is any progress being reported for that implementation, and is that reporting being verified? So starting to get closer to whether that change is actually happening in the supply chains.
Thanks, Emma. We've had a couple of people also ask whether it's possible to have a meeting with the Forest 500 team so they can better understand their scores and how they can improve. So yes, please do feel free to reach out to the team. And yeah, it's a lot of information to digest on a summer August day. So yes, please do. And a question from me, when can we next expect to hear from Forest 500, Emma? When can companies next expect to hear?
Yes, definitely. So the next time that you will hear from us is will be firstly with a recording of this webinar and a link to our methodology documents, which will likely be in a couple of days, potentially next week. But then after that, it will be to confirm the dates of that optional view period of the assessment. So that will be coming from the forest500@globalcanopy.org email address. So please do keep an eye out for emails from us. Probably that second email will come at some point in early September.
Great. And just I think one final question in the Q&A is, if you are a downstream company, such as a retailer, how can implementation be measured, given that downstream companies are very far away from deforestation?
So our methodology has different indicators for upstream companies, so producers and processors, and downstream companies, so the traders, manufacturers, and retailers. So for upstream companies, it is, the methodology is focusing on their own operations and their they are close to the point of production and the point where that deforestation or human rights abuses may occur. And so it's very focused on their own operations as well as the suppliers that are there. For the downstream companies, it is very much about how those companies can be pushing change through their supply chain. So really looking at, are they monitoring their suppliers for compliance? Are they engaging with suppliers? If they are found to be non-compliant, what does that look like? Do they have the right processes in place to effectively evaluate that compliance? So it kind of comes at it from both angles, depending on upstream and downstream companies.
Well, lots of information. So thank you very much for taking the time to join our webinar and find out more about the 2024 Forest 500's assessment period and for asking all of those very insightful questions. The updated Forest 500's company methodology will be available later this week. As Emma mentioned, we also have an insight piece on the Forest 500 website that you can refer to. If you do have any questions or you'd like a meeting, please do get in touch with the team at forest500@globalcanopy.org. That's forest500@globalcanopy.org. And again, this webinar has been recorded, so we'll share the recording link very, very shortly over email with you too. And then finally, we'd be very grateful if you could complete a very short survey that should show up in your web browser after this webinar. So thanks again, and goodbye for now.